Okay, ladies and gentlemen, let's get started. So 3 quick points from me before our main event. First of all, welcome back to all our GSF members. A special welcome to recent renewers or joiners. Your support is critical. Anyone who enjoys these events but has yet to join up, do jump in. The water's lovely. And then my next point is, whilst this is our final event for 2025, a quick commercial for our first lunchtime event of 2026, which will be here on Wednesday the 21st of January. Simon MacDonald, Lord MacDonald of Salford, now Master of Christ's College, Cambridge, and of course the former Permanent Under-Secretary at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, will give a lunchtime lecture. Intriguingly, it says here the title is to be confirmed, so not exactly a mystery speaker, but a mystery subject. So do please RSVP when invitations come early in the new year. I would say I've known Simon for 18 years. He is the consummate diplomat, I would say. I do hope he won't be when he speaks to us. But today, we are fortunate to have Jonathan Hall, KC, to speak to us. His predecessors, Lord Anderson of Ipswich and Sir Max Hill, have both addressed GSF in the past, and it's wonderful to have Jonathan here today to continue the series. You'll all have read his bio. I would note, wryly, that the government clearly wondered last year what our independent reviewer of counter-terrorism legislation was doing with his afternoons and added state threat legislation to his to-do list. But for me, he will always be, as the Daily Telegraph once headlined, our very own terror czar. Jonathan.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation on this very balmy London December day. 2025 has been the busiest year of my 6 years as reviewer. This year, as well as annual reviews, which is my sort of parliamentary obligation on terrorism and state threats. I've done a special report on the violence at Southport, new laws against state entities like Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and on reforming separation centres in prisons. I've spoken publicly about Palestine Action, given evidence to the Joint Committee on the National Security Strategy about the recently collapsed China spy trial. Today I want to speak for about 15 or so minutes. I'll only be able to touch on some of the infinite strands that these days fall within or adjacent to national security laws, and then I hope we can have questions and a conversation. None of what I've just said is by way of complaint about me being overwhelmed, far from it. The expectations on me are largely self-regulated. As long as I deliver my annual reports, it's up to me what other commissions I accept and what media engagements I do, and best of all, what topics I pursue. There are now equivalents to me in Australia and in the Republic of Ireland, but they're rather more formal. They come with more resources, but more responsibilities, and the strength of our role is its freedom and its flexibility. Now, it's impossible for a terrorism reviewer to talk about law and political violence without first referring to Northern Ireland, the fount and origin of our domestic laws against terrorism, and still, for all its flaws, home to a successful ongoing process of transition from violence to politics. I recall Sir John Major's tributes to Michael Ancram at the inaugural Lothian lecture earlier this year for his patience and commitment to peace in Northern Ireland. Sir John also said that a child today would not recognise life 50 years ago. He was referring to global instability, but he might equally have been referring to the greatest gulf between a child in the 1970s, when I was born, and a child today, and I will describe that gap as digital life. Digital life is central to national security. It's not an adjunct consideration. It's not to be categorised and dismissed by drawing analogies with earlier technologies like TV, which have, of course, caused moral panics in the past and then become integrated into our lives. To my mind, the online dimension is genuinely, categorically new. Consider the fact that children spend more time playing online than they do playing outside with one another, and that on one of the most popular online games for children, called Roblox, it is possible to enact a school massacre or a mosque shooting. Consider the chatbot named Sarai that encouraged a man to take a crossbow to Windsor to try and kill the late Queen. Think about Dylan Earle, recently sentenced for a total of 23 years. He was recruited online by the Wagner Group to arrange arson at a warehouse containing equipment destined to support Ukraine. All this is quite apart from the technical opportunities that adversaries will have for hostile surveillance, disruption through cyber attacks, new attack methodologies, etc. I would say that merely recording our digital life without dwelling on its profound implications for national security is a gross error when it comes to national security. It would not be strategic. And I found it surprising that the online dimension was not a major thematic in the national security strategy published in 2025. Part of my role as legal reviewer is to consider the impact on personal freedoms from laws concerning national security. Sometimes those laws that I review impact a narrow range of people. For example, in recent times, annually, there are up to 4 people who are subject to these things called terrorism prevention investigation measures. This is a very powerful, rare civil measure that's to deal with dangerous terrorists who can't otherwise be prosecuted. But also, some of the laws I look at affect a much broader range. For example, roughly 2,500 passengers per year are subject to no suspicion counter-terrorism examinations at ports and airports. They have to answer questions, they have got no right to silence, they have to hand over their digital media to be copied, etc. Incidentally, for many years, legal challenges to that power, known as Schedule 7, came from Muslim passengers. And it is indeed possible, is it not, that in a world where Islamist terrorism remains the greatest threat, that unfair and biased assumptions will on occasion be made in deciding who to target with this power, hence the need for vigilant review. However, I suspect that challenges these days are just as likely to come from the libertarian right. I'm thinking of Tommy Robinson's recent acquittal. He failed to comply with a Schedule 7 examination, and his acquittal, which I should say made sense on the evidence that was presented, was funded by Elon Musk. And I foresee similar challenges where police officers looking for signs of terrorism run up against free speech advocates. The broadest of all the counter-terrorism impacts from legislation is the so-called Martin's Law, which came in recently but was inspired by events back in 2017, the Manchester Arena attack. It's due to come into effect after an implementation of 24 months, and I continue to have reservations about the regulatory burden of this law, which requires tens of thousands of businesses, clubs, charities, anyone controlling premises to have plans for a terrorist attack. Another aspect relating to personal freedom and counter-terrorism legislation is that people should understand the laws that govern their behaviour and which promise, in the case of national security laws, to protect them. And this aspect was recently discussed by a House of Lords committee in their Rule of Law report, which is commendable for its lack of jargon and its clarity. Applying this point to our digital life, ministers continue to state that the Online Safety Act 2023 will make the UK the safest place to go online in the world. That's all very well, but I can assure you that every day a journalist, a researcher, a police officer, a concerned member of the public will find a piece of terrorism content online that, according to the Online Safety Act, simply shouldn't be there. In the last month, for example, well, in fact, in November, my special advisor, Adam Hadley, found a Facebook account openly identifying itself as affiliated to Islamic State, openly posting an instructional document on the, quote, deadliest places for stabbing, close quotes, on a body diagram, which had been online for at least a month and which remained accessible despite being reported to Facebook itself. In legal terms, this content counts as priority illegal terrorism content under the Online Safety Act, and a user-to-user service, such as Facebook, should have systems to detect, prevent, and remove it. This text had obvious keywords for automated flagging: deadliest, stabbing, knife, and it was on a site openly affiliated with the Islamic State. And the short point to make is that the Online Safety Act relies on tech platforms to apply safety duties. Ofcom, the regulator, Ofcom's role is to monitor these safety duties, but tech companies make it very difficult for regulators or researchers to monitor their output at scale. And nothing in the Online Safety Act allows the authorities to take down content or to order tech companies to take it down. But despite all of this, you will continue to hear ministers saying that the Online Safety Act makes the UK the safest place to be online. Now, returning to the relationship between members of the public and the law, I think we need much greater clarity about what the Online Safety Act can and cannot do. Digital life, our digital life, which affects national security, is too important for us to be left in the dark. Secondly, we need to keep looking at whether prescription, that's the tool used by the Home Secretary to ban terrorist organisations. It was used recently against Palestine Action, against a group called Maniac Murder Cult, and against the Russian Imperial Movement, whether that tool can be adapted without unintended consequences to deal with these vast online movements who venerate attackers like Brenton Tarrant of Christchurch, New Zealand, or Anders Breivik from Norway. These individuals and these movements, which aren't organisations, inspire copycat attacks, but they are not themselves organisations. Thirdly, we need to consider whether our pre-digital laws, which govern surveillance, are unduly restricting the ability of counter-terrorism authorities to consider publicly available information online. That is information that we've freely chosen to share with one another, and certainly with the tech companies, so that they can sell us advertising. Fourthly, however, I do think the UK needs to hold its nerve in the face of compelling challenges from free speech absolutists, generally based on principles found in the US Constitution, that in effect consider all regulation of the internet as a bad thing. I think that's not only just naive. Of course the internet is controlled. It's just controlled by the tech companies and their algorithm, not by us. But also, it's ultimately undemocratic because it suggests that we as a society, through our laws, cannot assert control over our digital lives despite the harms, especially the harms to children. This is why, for all its flaws, I do support the principle of the Online Safety Act. And incidentally, the US is no monolith. Individual states within the US are constantly trying to impose legislation to protect children, for example, safety by design rules. But time and time again, a trade body called NetChoice, a trade body for the tech companies, succeeds in striking down that state-based legislation on First Amendment grounds. I want to turn now to political violence. There is a classic debate about whether all terrorism is political, and so whether it's actually necessary to have the religious, racial, or ideological causes under the Terrorism Act. But what can be recently observed is violence relating to contested matters of domestic politics, which ideally would be resolved through the ballot box and not through violence. So, in 2025, a man called Paul Martin was convicted of terrorism at the Old Bailey for trying to lead a violent rebellion against COVID restrictions. In January this year, a man called Alexander Dighton stabbed a police officer because he thought the authorities had lost control of the UK borders. And of course, in the summer, Palestine Action was prescribed. Their actions are said to be motivated by views on arms sales to Israel. And I might also add that 2025 saw 2 attacks on think tanks, one on Policy Exchange earlier this year, and only a few weeks ago, the Tony Blair Institute. It is tempting, and I think not necessarily wrong, to draw a link with the 6th of January attack on the US Capitol in 2021, and with some of the other US political murders in recent times. For the first time, according to the eminent scholar Dan Byman of Georgetown University, there are more cases of political violence in the US coming from the left, think, for example, of the assassination carried out by Luigi Mangione, than the right, although it's fair to say that left-wing attacks tend to be much less deadly than right-wing attacks. But crudely put, these types of attacks can be distinguished from the Islamist extremist terrorism and neo-Nazi terrorist acts of recent years. What the Islamist extremists and the neo-Nazis want are not matters of domestic debate. A caliphate, Sharia law, a world free of subhuman non-whites, whatever. They are not on offer in any UK or US political party. But things like COVID restrictions, control of borders, divesting from Israel, are things that our politicians do agree and disagree about. This may explain why some people find the banning of Palestine Action so difficult. The cause is not as extreme as what motivates Islamist extremism and neo-Nazis, because what they promote is a matter of genuine debate. That said, I don't think it makes an ounce of difference. It's the methods that matter, not the cause. I'm afraid I draw a rather pessimistic conclusion from this type of violence. It seems to reflect a culture in which participation in mainstream democratic mechanisms, such as voting, political parties, think tanks, and of course non-violent political protest, are no longer perceived as effective or perhaps even legitimate. hence the move to direct action under cover of protest. This is an exhausted narcissism, where an appeal to the right side of history is a refusal to debate with one's fellow man. And none of this is improved, of course, if politicians debase the standards of public life, and I'm not referring to any UK politicians here, by posting falsehoods, playing to extremism, or abusing their office. I want to turn now to free speech because it's so central to debates about online safety and therefore national security. A picture of an Islamic State atrocity is a matter of historical record, and it can be shared in order to discredit Islamic State, but it can also be used to recruit followers and to encourage attacks, hence the debate. Our go-to reference points for the free speech debate remains the real world. For example, the Gaza protests happening in London, Elon Musk's speech at the Unite the Kingdom rally, again in London, or Bob Villan's death to the IDF chants at Glastonbury. Each of these examples give rise to weighty points of debate and a lecture in their own right. But generally speaking, in today's world, the egregious examples of people literally calling for death or encouraging terrorism, or calling for people to be killed in yet more violent ways, or to end their own lives, or to go and carry out sabotage for Russia, are to be found online. And here I suggest we are still floundering in the shallows. We have yet to achieve a mature analysis of the role and the value of online as opposed to offline speech. First of all, in the online domain, it is not the case that more speech is the remedy for bad speech, as proposed by John Stuart Mill and famously applied by Justice Brandeis of the US Supreme Court. It is not a marketplace of ideas, but an echo chamber where positions are generally hardened, not exposed as falsehood or as lacking nuance. Secondly, online disinformation is easier, cheaper, less accountable. I mean, think about anonymous accounts, and possibly more effective. I mean, think about the impact of a deep fake photograph. The pervasiveness of false information is potent enough to change some of the calculus on how much weight and respect should be given to online speech as a whole. Imagine a law student like me several years ago. I went into a law library and I was told half of all the factual assertions in that library, in the books, are false. That would affect my view of the library. Consider this extract from a recent paper from Sam Stockwell, who's a researcher at the Alan Turing Institute. And he was writing about the run-up to Australia's federal election in May 2025. A Russian-linked influence network published a large volume of fake news stories promoting pro-Kremlin narratives. Fine, we've all been there. The purpose of this, I think this is where it becomes really interesting, the purpose was, quotes, to attract the search engine crawlers used to build AI chatbots, thereby distorting the data these tools draw upon to produce responses that promoted Russian interests. And it was found during tests that nearly 17% of chatbots' answers amplified these false narratives, demonstrating the moderate gains attackers could make using this relatively cheap technique. I think that we need a John Stuart Mill for the online age. Finally, in considering the difference between regulating real speech and online speech, there is a point to be made about the mode of counteraction. Countering terrorist content online generally means removing the electronic signals that make up the content. Stopping speech in the real world must generally be done through arrest or prosecution, or the threat of arrest or prosecution, all of which carries a greater impact, I would suggest, on individuals. I will end with Subversion. We don't exactly need King's College London to tell us this, but a recent survey by King's College London, reported in the Times, found an increase in the sense of national division and the loss of pride in our country. A major aspect is once again the online dimension. In the words of the Telegraph's Tim Stanley, algorithms pushing division are a, quote, technological development that has aligned with or caused or hastened the collapse of 20th century norms. Now, to pull some optimism from that sort of catastrophic assessment, I am glad that the UK legal system, which is not based on absolutist notions of free speech as in the US, does allow us to do something about it before it's too late. And as much as it's important to be realistic, it's also important not to talk up division. The collapse of the West is one of the key Russian themes the Kremlin promotes, directly or through the dark PR firms that it employs. It would also play nicely into China's vision for a world order if we junked democracy and reached for the strongman. You may recall some recent images carried in the media of black-clad and masked thugs in the East End the other month. It's possible that this was an Islamist power play to try and dominate the streets, and that is often the case, as I found in my own work, in prisons, a desire to dominate space. But it is also possible, is it not, that rumours were circulating in the Muslim population about imminent attacks and that young men came onto the streets in self-defence and in genuine fear. The problem is that we often don't know what other people are seeing in their online feeds, and I think we shouldn't be over-hasty in judging other people until we know what they believe to be the facts, which they will get from social media. One of the strengths of terrorism and national security laws is that they are threat neutral, which allows the authority to say that our laws are not anti-Islam or anti-Irish or anti-white or anti-China. I think it's more difficult when we get to extremism. We may know it when we see it, but it's hard to come up with an abstract definition. So I confess, I tend to run a mile when I see an anti-extremism law. But I'll end by saying that countering extremism, or fostering cohesion, or identifying a core set of British values, or encouraging resilience as part of a wider project to protect national security from subversion, these are buoys that we are likely to go around many, many times in the coming years. A simpler fix, of course, is to make sure that different parts of our system talk to one another, as the failure of the spy trial tends to illustrate. Another is to make sure that the organs of democratic life in the UK are protected, within which I do include the BBC, given how much the UK's adversaries want the BBC to fail. I think it's worth making that point. I include local media, think tanks, universities, charities, and NGOs. But whatever we do, we need to put the online domain front and centre in the protection of national security. I will end on an optimistic note. We are in the online foothills, but we will learn and adapt. I think society is becoming stronger in protecting children from online dangers, and all eyes will be on Australia, whose social media ban comes into force for the under-16s in 8 days' time. I think that protecting children is not a bad place to start. Thank you.
Lots to get our teeth into there. Thank you very much, Jonathan. So this is a hybrid event. For those attending remotely via Zoom, if you have questions, please submit them in writing through the Q&A function. And if you're in the room, please would you await the handheld microphone from Jacqueline, and please give your names when you do that. The report's been recorded. Recording will be made online as soon as possible. Details of how to access it via our YouTube channel will be posted on a website that you can work out for yourselves. So, Jonathan, can I ask you, could you just unpack for us your concern that pre-digital laws governing surveillance may be unduly restricting the ability of particularly CT authorities, counter-terrorism authorities, to consider publicly available information online?
Yeah, so let me give you the example. I go and see a lot of different parts of the system, Home Office, departments for science, information and technology, counter-terrorism police. Let's say they suspected that there was a node, a Twitter account, that was part of a Russian disinformation network. It's very useful for the authorities to be able to look at that account and say, well, who are they following? Who are they followed by? What other tweets have they done? Are they using a local dialect? Could we try and work out where they are? Now, in your old world, that's sort of normal business. But in the world of policing, it requires, under the laws that we have at the moment, the pre-digital laws, an authorisation to carry out surveillance. And it all goes back to Article 8, which everyone will know is the article of the European Convention on Human Rights, which protects personal life and the way in which it's been interpreted by the European Court of Human Rights, which is very expansive and effectively goes back to the days of the Second World War, when the authorities were collecting files and working out who were the Jews. So you'd go around and say, well, we're going to... So the idea of collecting information has become a central core of European jurisprudence. It's been now applied quite widely, and it includes information that's obtainable from the public. So I think that when I know, because I speak to them, I know that the authorities would like to be able to do more work. And we're not talking about covert stuff, we're talking about information that people have put online deliberately. They would like to be able to use that more freely, as they do, I should say, in the US. The US take the view, if it's online, it's available. So that's what that's about.
Yeah, intriguing. And secondly, I don't know if this is disingenuous, it probably is, but I don't really care. So taking your words only slightly out of context, you said that one of the strengths of our terrorism and national security laws is that they are threat neutral. You then said in the context of prescription, you noted that it's the methods that matter, not the cause. So my question is, why is it so difficult then to call out state threat actors?
If you want the long answer to that, you can read my report on state threats. In the UK, the position has been taken as a matter of policy that states can't commit terrorism. And if you look at the debates that have taken place at the international level in the UN, there have been certain issues that always stood in the way of states coming up with an agreed definition of terrorism. One of them is the freedom fighter paradox. Well, if you're fighting for freedom, can you be a terrorist? And the other one is whether or not a state can commit an act of terrorism. The UK's view has always been no. And so they've always taken the view, and this was really illustrated in the Salisbury attack. So remember the Novichok poisoning. No counter-terrorism powers were used at all because they knew it was Russia and therefore they didn't want to treat it as terrorism. So it's a policy. I mean, my own view is it's also legally right. I don't think when the Terrorism Act was passed, it was ever intended to catch. So that's the technical answer to that question.
Okay, let's open it up. So remember the rules. Front row, I'm afraid, Jacqueline. Front row. If you could just remind us who you are, sir.
Thank you. Ali Bahajou, the Centre of European and African Studies. You mentioned about Australia deciding that to ban social media for under 16. Would it be good for Britain to emulate that? And also, you have not referred to artificial intelligence and its grey area as well. Thank you.
Yes, it would be a good idea, I think, to restrict under 16s. The argument is, well, you could always get around it, which is true. Children will use VPNs, which is a way of making it look as if you're accessing the internet from another part of the world. They will also find apps, etc. But we have laws against speeding and laws against shoplifting. And I think the thing, I was really persuaded when I had a conversation with an Australian official, and she said, look, Jonathan, really a lot of this is about children and their parents or their carers. It really helps parents just to be able to say, you can't do that. Why? Because it's a crime. And so I think I would absolutely, in terms of artificial intelligence, there are two aspects to the debate, I think. There is what creative ways can terrorists and extremists make use of artificial intelligence? The best way they can use is translation. I mean, it doesn't sound very glamorous, but actually instantaneous translation into all the languages of the world is a fantastic free facility for terrorists if they want to propagate their message. The other aspect, which is genuinely new, is the chatbot. And I mean, no one in this room, I'm sure, will have done it. But if you go onto the App Store and you look up Replica AI friend, it's all sex, okay? It's all curvaceous women and hunky men, and they are trying to encourage our children and our young people to enter into deeper and deeper relationships with always accessible, always on, sexy AI models, chatbots. It is completely foreseeable, and I mentioned that case in my talk, that people will get involved with chatbots who will encourage them to carry out acts of terrorism. And all the checks and balances that we take for granted, the fact that if I say something idiotic, Iain will say, well, hang on, Jonathan, what are you talking about? All of that will be lost because they'll be in a dialogue of death with the chatbot.
Very good. Third row. Thanks, sir.
Stephen Dale, lifelong Russia analyst. Jonathan, you mentioned in one of the answers to Surin's question, in passing it seems, you mentioned the European Commission on Human Rights, European Council on Human Rights.
Convention.
Convention on Human Rights. please correct me, I'm not sure whether you're coming down on the side of being we should be a member or because it restricts us we should leave. My feeling is that if this country were to leave the ECHR, then it puts us in a bracket with Russia and Belarus as the only European countries who aren't in it. And it could cause so many other political problems everywhere else. What is your opinion on the ECHR?
My opinion is that some of the interpretations of Article 8, both the interpretations made by the court and by our own judges, have gone too far. I just did a report on prisons, and some of the interpretations of private life have made it very difficult for prison officers to deal with the most dangerous terrorists. I think that there's probably a fix that doesn't involve leaving the convention, but I'm absolutely sure that the convention has been interpreted in a way that went way beyond what anyone intended. I mean, I leave it to others whether you have to come out or not. But I don't think what I'm saying is particularly unorthodox. I think many people recognise that some of the interpretations, particularly of Article 8, went way further than was ever intended.
Great question. Second row, I think. Sorry, and then we'll go to the fourth row.
Christopher Samuel, ex-naval officer. So there are, I believe it's 140,000 lawyers in this country. There are fewer than that in the armed services. At the moment, I'm beginning to feel very, very afraid because it seems that obvious, what are sometimes being called common sense answers are just impracticable. Can't be done. He's got another right. Can you at all assure me that people are sorting out the laws that we have, throwing out the ones that don't apply to us in your new digital area, and trying to make life simpler and more secure? Sorry for such a roundabout question.
No, it's a fair question. I mean, in my own way, I have tried to do that. For example, I found an extraordinary anti-common sense approach to terrorism affected by the Modern Slavery Act. And there's a famous tragic example of a girl called Rhiannon Rudd who was recruited by a neo-Nazi. She ended up being on bail for a long time, and one of the delays of her actually getting to court or not was a 4-month modern slavery assessment, which, having poked around the system and interrogated the system, I think was just wrong-headed. She killed herself because no one was willing to say whether she should be prosecuted, which would perhaps be one solution, or put on prevent, which would be much better for her. And that delay was caused by a finicky approach to the law by people who hadn't really thought it through but were committed to it. Going through Parliament at the moment is abolition of the Modern Slavery Act as it applies to terrorism offences, which is something I've recommended. I think the other way in which things could be improved is if you ever read judgments of the... I don't know whether are you a lawyer?
No.
But if you ever read judgments of the... I never believe that when I hear that. But when, the Supreme Court does two things. I mean, the highest court in the land, it does its judgment, and it does a press summary. And I cannot tell you how effective that press summary is. And I do wonder sometimes if judges are doing a judgment and they have to prepare a short press summary that makes sense in the court of public opinion, that might actually help realise, well, actually, it's got to make sense to people who can't plough through hundreds of pages. So I rather sort of fantasise about the idea of more press summaries, actually, as a way of ensuring that when judges do follow the threads, they are always grounded in what you might call common sense.
By the pillar, please, Jacqueline. Excellent.
Thank you. Christopher Eccleston, investment banker. So you would not like to have 16-year-olds accessing social media, but there are many who would like to move the voting age down to 16. So are we suggesting that we have a generation of political news illiterates going into the voting booth? because that's effectively what we're saying here. When I was younger than 16, I was reading a bunch of newspapers every day. Those newspapers, well, some of them don't exist anymore, and the newspapers that are around are totally defanged and trivial. There's much less choice in print media. So how are these new generation of voters supposed to go in and make a decision if they've been kept quite literally in the dark? And this is the Sarah Hurwitz clause here.
Yes. I mean, I haven't said that I would support reducing the age of voting to 16. I mean, just speaking as a private citizen, because that's nothing to do with terrorism, I don't agree with that. But I don't think it's right to say that there would be a total news vacuum. I mean, my fantasy is that every child is given a dumb phone with the BBC app on and some other sort of news apps. And that could be given on the NHS, and it would just sort of replace everything. But, I mean, look, first of all, it's not a news vacuum. Secondly, I grew up before social media, as did you, and we had people to talk to. And thirdly, I think that you underestimate the negative effect of disinformation online. I mean, it's not, is it, that children are the only place they can get real information about to make political choices comes from the internet. Actually, probably the one place they find falsehood is through the internet. So I don't think I share your views on that.
I sense a longer discussion on that one. Over to the other side of the room. That's well done this side.
John Everard, used to be FCO, now FCDO. We talked about the Australian ban coming in 8 days' time, the ban on under 16-year-olds accessing social media. I worry. I think that what's going to happen is that the access to social media becomes a kind of forbidden fruit amongst teenagers, like various other forbidden fruits that some of us may have tasted earlier than others. And that on your 16th birthday it becomes a kind of rite of passage. You dive into social media, and all you've achieved by banning access up to that point is to push the problem back to people who are 17, 18. There's a heroic assumption that these people are somehow more mature than people who are 16. It seems to me that there's a case to be made, not for banning access, but for giving social media education, allowing young people to develop the antibodies to all the rubbish that floats around, getting people to understand that a lot of what's reading social media is wrong, learn to argue against it, and learning to have the courage to switch off. What do you think?
I don't agree with that. I mean, this is the digital native / digital inoculation argument. And the cliff edge points are quite worthy of discussion. But I mean, there's no inoculation against some of this stuff that they see online. I mean, I don't know if you're on Twitter or something like that, but I mean, I like to think I'm a fairly rational person. Okay, right. But I see a volume of stuff and I can feel it. I can feel it making me angry. So I would doubt, because I think you're going back to the sort of J.S. Mill Brandeis thing. Well, this is a marketplace of ideas. We can have discussions. But remember, when someone is interacting with the internet, they're not really capable, are they? So they see a picture of a whole load of Muslim-looking men attacking some young white girl on the street. Let's say that's it. I mean, it might be true. I don't see where you can get this sort of inoculation. Okay, you might say yourself, part of my mind, I know it's false, but there's a study, isn't there? I can't remember it's not called reinforcement. But even when people are told that they are what they have seen is false, it still has an effect on them. So I like the idea. I mean, I think the real reason I've come to the view that the ban is appropriate is that the Online Safety Act is never going to work at the level of content. And if you can't get rid of the really vicious content against which there are no psychological safeguards, the only alternative, I think, is the ban. That's where I get to it.
At the front, please, Jacqueline. But just while you're getting here, there's an interesting thing, isn't there, between misinformation and disinformation. Misinformation, things are wrong. Disinformation, things are deliberately wrong, perhaps seeking to provoke a particular response and so on. And then further down that track, you have subversion, I guess, as well, when it's done with a bigger...
Yeah, I mean, I also think that we're also playing with our arms behind our backs, aren't we? Because, I mean, the tech companies, as we know, they had psychologists to try and work out what would make us engage with the platforms. They realised, for example, that a nice ping noise when an email arrives gives us a dopamine hit, and that will keep us engaged. I mean, they have got the scientists, they have got the knowledge, they know how to target us.
Fascinating. Sir.
David Hannay, I sit on the International Agreements Committee in the House of Lords, and our job partly is to scrutinise new international agreements like, for example, the UK-India free trade area. And the general conventional wisdom is that the digitalisation of international trade is, quote, a good thing, and that we should be working to include the freest form of digitalisation into our trade agreements. Given what you said, are we being naive?
I think you're going with the political flow. I mean, but I mean, you know, if you think about Rishi Sunak's idea, the UK would become a sort of leader in AI regulation. That's gone out the window now because of the current government and the previous government's desire for AI growth. Again, that's another reason why I've moved towards the ban. If you think about the process of, let's go back to my field, the internet, and removing content, that would require a degree of regulation that would allow the Home Secretary to make an order. That order would have to be enforced somehow, which would bring you slap bang against a very powerful tech industry at the moment, backed up by the administration, who would start saying, well, we're not going to build a Google in King's Cross. So, I mean, whether it's right or wrong, it's the way of the world at the moment.
Sebastian Cayley, you made an offhand reference to the technologists just now knowing how to get us jumping. I'm, by God, not young enough to be a digital native, but I've bred a small tribe of such, one of whom now consults for Google. These companies are running the largest social psychology experiments in the history of the world, with sample sizes of billions. They can test which shade of blue sells more vegetables. And they're doing so extremely effectively. The phrase that went around the world, the attention economy, I think is a misnomer. The correct phrase, at least in this year, is the rage economy. Because they long ago, about 10 years ago, they moved from selling us things that made us laugh or happy, puppies, small children doing silly things. They realized that it was more efficient to make us angry. That made us more likely to respond, send on, engage, stay online, all the things that make them the sums of money that we know they earn. So there's no question, Jonathan, I just thought I should add that from the coalface of the tech firms. They are employing, I saw this in Oxford, they're employing the best psychologists in the world. To the tune of tens of thousands of them. If you do a PhD in experimental psychology, you have two career options, the 30, 40, 50,000 a year academic route, or up to 10 times that as a starting salary in these awful, awful companies.
Very interesting.
Thank you.
We're very happy to take points dressed up as questions, I think, Jonathan.
Very. If they support my central thesis.
That as well. There's a very good thought for the day on today this morning, actually, about rage and compassion, which is worth digging out. Anybody? I think we had one halfway back on the left, Jacqueline, and then if you can continue walking towards the back, we've got two candidates in the back row.
B. Larry's corporate advisor. Thank you very much, Jonathan, for a great presentation. If the UK is not the safest place to go online, which countries, in your views, would be, while obviously protecting the privacy of citizens, and any lessons to be learned from them? Thank you.
Yeah. I anticipated the question. The answer is I don't know, because unless I live in another country, but I would have thought it was probably China, but of course I don't want to live in China. So I think that we have to reframe what we mean by the safest place. I think you qualified your question by saying where our freedoms are protected. And the answer is I don't know. I really pray that Australia has success.
Super question. 1 and 2, yes, thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Mike Salem. I'm a consultant. Thank you very much for your lecture. Very interesting. I found your parenting advice as well very
Do you like give any parenting
poignant.
advice?
I'm not sure parents would derive authority for their children from the government, but each people have their own parenting style. My question pertains to the UN Convention of the Right of Child, which guarantees freedom of expression and freedom of association. So banning social media for those under 16 might risk that. And secondly, do you consider social media platforms being public or private spaces? Because I think that's very important for the narrative. Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, on the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child, I mean, all rights are, if it's not a right against being tortured, qualified in some way. So, I just don't think that is a sort of massive gotcha. I mean, they've got rights of expression, whether they do it online or offline. If you look at the Ofcom report, 11th edition of the longitudinal study of digital childhood, it's made the point that one of the changes since 11 years ago is that when children are interacting online, they're much less creative now. A lot of what happens online now is simply passive consumption, it's often marketing. So I think that the online dimension is probably inhibiting children's expression, even if you include within expression digital interaction. What the second question was?
Public and private.
Yeah, I mean, public and private. The way that the terrorism law approaches this is it's a bit of a rule of thumb. So the smallest group that is counted as public for the purpose of terrorism offences was a 15-person WhatsApp group where someone encouraged someone to let off a bomb. I have written, actually, an academic article about this. The view I take is that public has to include the affordances, which is the posh word to say, what can you do with that digital information? Could you share it very easily? And there's obviously some content which I might put into a very small WhatsApp group that I'm running with Iain, but the whole purpose is, I know that Iain is able to promote it in some other way, and the whole point of it, because it's a Islamic State publication, is for it to get widespread notoriety. So I think that I would probably not look at the sort of numbers approach, but I'd look at what could happen to it and what the intention behind it. And on that basis, some WhatsApp groups are effectively like a dining room table, and I would preserve some degree of privacy. People are family just discussing. I've got a WhatsApp group you probably have with your kids and whatever. Other ones not.
Okay, in the corner, please, Jack.
John Wilson, a member of GSF, Rusi, Chatham House, and also the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators. As a child of the 30s, I've been brought up on the post-Second World War law, what I would call the Western equitable laws. However, with the rise of the autocracies, and in the case of Russia and China, they seem to have an entirely different perception of the interpretation of law. They use law as a controlling body. I mean, the national security law of China can by no means be described as equitable. Where do you see the rule of law in the world going in the future?
Well, I think that, I mean, the China-UK distinction is a fabulously interesting one. When I first took on the role of reviewing the National Security Act, I had a call from Ming Pao, the Hong Kong journal. So I phoned up the government and said, this is some sort of weird sort of spy thing? And they said, no, speak to these people. And the point was that the Chinese used our law, our National Security Act, as a template for their law, ironically. So, I mean, I think that illustrates the point that merely having a law, complying with the law, is not enough, and it depends upon the political settlement on which it operates. The really hard thing, again, thinking about national security again, is when you think about protecting our country against espionage, is the people who might do it. And whereas within the UK, you will have the intelligence agencies, the police, and they will be running some human sources, in principle, under the National Security Act in China, every citizen of that enormous country has an obligation to assist in national security. And if you look at our definition of foreign intelligence service, in principle, it could apply extraordinarily widely in order to capture that sort of behaviour. I mean, I think that I'm rather attracted to the idea that some people promote, which is about there being some space within society which is purely civil. In other words, not every part of our society has to become an adjunct of the security services. So you do have health, you do have schools, you do have journalists. That's our way of doing things, and I think our laws operate effectively. When every single person within a community is part of the intelligence apparatus, it's very difficult.
And then, lady, there you go. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Lama Shahadi. I'm a reporter with The National. I wanted to know how you would police content online, extremist content online that's not violent, but referring to a utopia to recruit people.
I mean, the simple answer is I really don't know. I mean, I'm a lawyer, so I'm attracted to definitions, and particularly when you're talking about freedom of speech, you wouldn't want to have a big censor who simply says, I like that, I don't like that, and you would like them to have some sort of definition to operate under. I think that most extremist speech that we're legitimately worried about has a link to violence. And so if you think about Hizb ut-Tahrir, so going on the offline world now, Hizb ut-Tahrir have always been seen for a long period of time as extremists, but after 7th of October, they started to say this was a really good thing and promote its violent activities. That allowed the Home Secretary, to say that they were a terrorist organisation, and they were then proscribed. So I like to think that you'd probably catch those people. If you're trying to define extremism without reference to violence, it's really, really hard. And Theresa May's government tried in 2015, found it really hard. There's the Michael Gove's definition of extremism, which on one view would catch people who campaign against the House of Lords. So it's really hard, that.
Just two down and two in. That's me. Sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is John Dobson. I'm a journalist with the Indian Saturday Guardian. Could I put my question or frame it in a hypothetical sense? Imagine I'm a BBC editor. I'm talking about free speech now. And I want to put a program together, half an hour or so, on a world leader's speech, which maybe he rambles on for about 2 hours. And I stitch together this half-hour program, which in fact contains only what this world leader said. And at the end, it's broadcast. This is hypothetical, of course.
Cool.
And it comes back to me that I am now breaking the law, in his view. Should I be legally responsible for what I put out?
I mean, in that scenario, I don't see how you... I mean, the approach the Online Safety Act has taken is to protect recognised media organisations. And I think there's a lot of wisdom in, although it wouldn't seem acceptable to people who are citizen journalists, to providing extra protections against any sort of prosecution for the BBC or ITN or whatever. I think that's legitimate because of the way in which they operate their editorial standards. If you were a citizen journalist and you stitched together a leader's speech in order to affect a member of parliament who's about to vote on some issue, and it could be said that what you were doing was deceptive, and if you were doing it to benefit a foreign power, or you had been tasked by a foreign power, then you would commit an offence under the National Security Act. And one of the problems about the law is that deception's often in the eye of the beholder, isn't it? So, I mean, fortunately, our law also requires that connection to a foreign power. And I mean, in your example, it wouldn't be a problem at all because you're doing it as an independent BBC journalist.
Very good. One over there, please.
Has introduced a new definition of Islamophobia recently, and there's been a bit of criticism about the new. Can you comment on it?
Yes, it hasn't. there was a committee chaired by a former MP called Dominic Grieve, but the definition hasn't been published or endorsed, so I think we're all in a state of waiting on that.
Any more before I ask a killer last question? Anything online, Jacqueline? Anything you want to bring out? Okay. Oh, I did warn you. All right, okay. Well, first of all, thank you. We're going to finish sharp by 2 o'clock, so I will draw matters to a conclusion. You said a couple of things which have convinced me, I will confess. Digital life is central to national security and not an adjunct consideration. Useful to see that written down so clearly. And certainly the online dimension is genuinely new. I think you do have enough to do in the afternoons. I think that's fair to say. But there was an optimistic note. I don't know if anybody else blinked and missed it right at the end of Jonathan's note when you said, protecting children from online dangers is not a bad place to start. I guess my harder question is, okay, then what? And why? What's going to happen next after that to make this an optimistic point rather than a single point issue?
Well, I think we will start to get data on how people act when they are not online the whole time. One of the things that I keep on saying to the Home Office and the police is, look, you've actually already got a data bank for adults, which is terrorists who go to prison. Now, obviously, some terrorists can get access to devices, but they're probably small. You know, these tiny phones. You don't need to know why they have them, tiny phones. Anyway, but you'll have people whose principal offending happened because they were online, they were maybe encouraging terrorist acts. They may have there's someone who got 11-year sentence for simply encouraging online. I mean, he'll be inside for probably 6 or 7 years, and he'll come out with having had probably no real online dimension. And I think that is wonderful data to start working out the hard question, which is what do we do next? I mean, it may be that you start to extend it to slightly, I mean, there's a school of thought that says that people under the age of 25 are still developing, so you might do it incrementally. You might start to approach it like the cigarette ban approach, but at least we're going to get some data, and I think that's quite optimistic.
Brilliant, thank you. Any last reflection of yourself, of your own, that you'd like to give before we launch into spontaneous applause?
No, that was great, thank you.
Spontaneous applause. Thank you very much. Brilliant.